And I'll be honest with you, I think this is a COVID cover-up. The £200 million pandemic inquiry protects the establishment by claiming that lockdowns, masking and vaccine tyranny were essential and that we should have started earlier. If they think that if we'd gone earlier with the lockdowns by 1 week, that somehow all would have been rosy in the garden, I'm so sorry. They are living in fantasy land. Well, what did you sacrifice for the pandemic yourself, for the lockdowns that we're now told were not necessary? This from Lee in Hampshire. Good morning, Mark. What did I sacrifice through lockdown? Well, ironically, the one thing the lockdown that was supposed to save, and that was my health. Excessive drinking, no exercise, isolation, depression, poor diet, and going mad. This from David. Good morning, Mark. 464 pages of utter guff and £200 million spaffed up the wall on smarmy lawyers. And what for? All to debate what happened between the 12th of March and the 23rd of March, and then to wee on my shoes and try to convince me that it's raining. We need an inquiry into the inquiries. They're just a gravy train for the London elite to take another bite at the taxpayers' cherry. David, a brilliant, brilliant message. I'll get to more of your thoughts in just a moment. We've got some breaking news. The average annual energy bill will rise by 0.2% in January, despite wholesale costs falling. That's right. The average energy bill will rise by 0.2% in January, despite wholesale costs falling, according to Ofgem. I'm so confused, Christian, because we've got an energy secretary in Ed Miliband that said because of his green revolution, bills were going to come down, weren't they, by £300. Well, it turns out they are going up. And that is while the cost of gas and oil continues to fall. Make it make sense. Well, someone that will make it make sense is Liam Halligan. He's an economist, he's a Telegraph columnist, and he's the co-host of Planet Normal, which is a hit podcast with Alison Pearson that spoke out against the madness of lockdowns and other COVID measures during the pandemic. He joins me now. Good morning, Liam.
Morning, Mark. Good to be with you.
Great to see you, and thank you so much for making the valuable time. I'm calling this a COVID cover-up, a £200 million pandemic inquiry protecting the establishment by claiming that lockdowns, masking and vaccine tyranny were essential. What's your view?
I've got a lot of sympathy with that view, Mark. It seems to be a £192 million. Get it right? Yeah. A huge amount of money on.
I was adding VAT.
Huge amount of money on an inquiry that completely misses the point, because it's just a 200 million quid I told you so.
Yeah.
It's the establishment wrapping us all over the knuckles for asking awkward questions and saying we were completely right. The UK is pretty harsh by international standards. Lockdown was completely the right thing to do, but you should have listened to us even more than you did. It should have been earlier, faster, harder. And we spent all this money and we haven't asked the most important question, Mark. And the most important question was and is, was lockdown the right thing to do, given that you had experiences in other countries that had better outcomes than us in terms of health, in terms of less economic damage, and yet their lockdowns were much looser. They didn't close down schools. I'm thinking of Sweden, but other countries too. We should be asking the question in this inquiry, was lockdown the right thing to do? Would we do lockdown again under the same circumstances? But that cardinal question has been completely dodged by this utterly self-serving and grotesquely expensive inquiry.
Well, I completely agree. And I think that, the junk modelers, the prophets of doom at Sage, and the political and media class who back lockdowns are now claiming victory, which I think is a sick joke, Liam, given the fact that we've now got an NHS waiting list of almost 8 million people. We've got an enormous national debt of over 2 trillion now, which is incalculable, isn't it? It's mind-boggling amounts of money. A generation of damaged kids, a mental health tsunami, and a completely broken economy.
That's right. Lockdown resulted, of course, in massive economic damage, a huge increase in the national debt that which we're still labouring under, as you say. It resulted in all kinds of damage to the mental health of our kids, but also lots of other people as well. And no one's saying, that COVID was some kind of hoax. No one's saying that at all.
No.
I think what people are saying, and there were very few of us during lockdown who spoke out in the way that we did, certainly on Planet Nor, because it was an extremely censorious environment. No one's saying that COVID wasn't an issue and people didn't die from COVID. Of course they did. What we're saying is that it may well have been better, and numerous scientific studies show this now, or at least strongly suggest it, if we had a looser kind of lockdown, with kids still going to school, with people segregating based on specific needs, whether they were elderly, whether they had pre-existing conditions. Some people were obviously more susceptible to lockdown, and as a society, we should have responded, and we should next time. But the question is, did it make sense to completely lock down the economy? And doing massive economic damage, which itself caused deaths of people? Did it make sense to make the NHS, Mark, a completely COVID-only service? So we now have massive waiting lists and waiting lists upon the waiting lists. Many, many people didn't get the cancer screening that they should have done, the other preventative measures that they should have done, which in turn have caused all kinds of knock-on impacts, and an NHS which is completely overburdened. If you look around the world, Mark, if you look at the Italians, the Swedes, for instance, both countries responded to lockdown in a different way to us, but both have had pretty short, concise, well-focused inquiries in a matter of weeks and months, so the lessons can be learned. We've had this really drawn-out process. An awful lot of villas in Umbria will have been purchased off the back of the money that was spent on this inquiry, because it has been a lawyer's bonanza paid for by us, and the lawyer's bonanza has helped fuel basically a cover-up, in the sense that the inquiry is not examining the questions that it should be examining, which is, was it right to lock down, and would we do the same in the future? And there's almost nothing on that key question. It's just a finger-pointing exercise telling us plebs that the high-ups were right and we should shut up about it.
It's hard to find evidence anywhere in the world that lockdowns drastically moved the dial in relation to the virus. You mentioned Sweden, who have had the lowest excess deaths in the whole of Europe from 2020 to 2023. That was the period of the pandemic. And there are states in America like Florida and Texas who had full football stadia, pop concerts. No one was wearing masks. It was like another country. Meanwhile, in California and New York, they were locked down for years.
I think what lockdown showed is the kind of inherent censoriousness of lots of people in power. And once they get power, they wanted to assert that power.
Yeah.
And also, to be honest with you, while lockdown did bring out some of the best of us in terms of neighborliness and looking after each other and so on, it did also bring out a heavy kind of snitch tendency and an informant tendency and a finger-pointing tendency. And that was really nasty, actually. That was really, really horrible, and I think it shocked quite a lot of people. Look, we've massively overspent on this inquiry. It's massively over-engineered. It costs far too much money, and the scope of it wasn't only wrongly focused, Mark. Let's be honest. It was deliberately focused, the scope, in order to avoid the key question. And the key question isn't, should we have locked down on this day or that day? We're trying to prove counterfactuals there. You can never really know. The key question is to have a long, honest look at this, and were the high-ups, who obviously have very difficult decisions to make. No one's saying it wasn't difficult, and Baroness Hallett's report makes that clear. But were they right in principle to lock down the entire economy, to lock down kids, to make people stay at home by force of law, to completely shut down all activity, or as much activity as possible? Because that has had enormous knock-on implications in terms of our mental health, in terms of our national debt, in terms of our sense of cohesion, in terms, Mark, of people just getting up and going to work. The long tail of this pandemic, how we responded to COVID, is going to be with us for years and years and years to come. And all this inquiry will do is add to a sense that the population was done to by high-ups, rather than the sense that this was a national emergency, an international emergency that we needed to respond to as a country, learn the lessons and move on.
Well, definitely. Before I let you go, Liam, this is a voice note from Judith on the COVID inquiry. Take it away, Judith.
Good morning, it's Judy from Altoffs, West Yorkshire. How did that lady come to the decision that thousands and thousands would have been saved if the lockdown a week earlier? It doesn't tally right. Sweden didn't lock down at all. I think it had the same amount of deaths as we did, or even less. So I don't know how she's come to that. And also, I think what happened we had a longer lockdown because those in charge of advising Boris Johnson scared him to death because he nearly died with COVID. And that have explained to him that really, if you don't lock down longer, you'll be in charge of thousands of people dying.
Well, there you go. Common sense from Judith, Liam Halligan. We got common sense from the public, and I had it on talk when I was doing the drive time show during COVID, and with people calling me saying it makes no sense to shut down the economy, keeping healthy people at home, causing all of that damage to our society for a nasty virus, yes, one that took too many lives, but one that was non-fatal to the vast majority of the population. There were only a handful of voices and publications that really stood up against the madness of COVID. Liam, we had the Telegraph newspaper, the Daily Mail to a degree, and I'm delighted to say Talk, previously Talk Radio, myself, MG, Julie Hartley-Brewer, and most notably, you and Alison Pearson on the podcast Planet Normal. You were lone voices at that time. Was that a lonely place to be?
Yeah, it was. It cost me enormously, professionally, personally, completely ostracized.
Were you a bad person? You were a granny killer, right?
Yeah, right. Completely insane. And that was the kind of censorious environment that was there. And let's be completely clear. You know, I think the Baroness Hallett's report, partly it's about the response of, you know, the devolved nations of the UK. I think it was outrageous how, you know, first ministers in Scotland and Wales were constantly kind of crank up the censoriousness. You know, certainly Nicola Sturgeon, she was always for longer, faster, harder, firmer lockdowns in order to try and shame England into doing even longer, faster, firmer, harder lockdowns.
Yeah.
It was a completely mad situation. And a lot of our politicians showed their worst side. I think the fact Boris Johnson's instincts initially were not to lock down, on the contrary, and then he got COVID himself, and the Prime Minister almost died. That is actually how it happened. And then I do think he wasn't the man he was after he'd previously been after that. And I do think political leaders were almost railroaded by a power crazed state into locking us down ever more. So I do think it was probably the biggest policy mistake in this country's certain modern history. It was an absolutely hugely, deeply damaging thing to do, and many other countries managed the situation a lot better than the UK did. There were good things done in terms of how we responded, but I think the overwhelming arc of the UK's response was far, far too censorious and dim, really. We should have been listening to leading epidemiologists around the world who we interviewed on Planet Normal under huge pressure not to interview them, frankly, who said the best thing to do would be to have discretionary shielding. People can shield if they want to, if their doctor tells them that they should, and so on. But you don't lock down the whole country. You don't lock down the kids. You don't lock down schools. And that's the so-called Great Barrington Declaration, after the place in the US where these three epidemiologists from the US met from leading universities around the world, declared that Great Barrington Declaration about how we respond to to lockdown. And the thing was basically, censored by. It was hard to find it, on the internet to sign this thing. It was a real kind of clampdown that you can't have any kind of free thinking. We just have to respond in a certain way. So I do think it was a really, obviously there were lots of deaths. No one's saying that there weren't. And there are massive human tragedies linked to lockdown in terms of people who caught COVID and then died under ghastly circumstances. But some of the really ghastly aspects of lockdown were caused by lockdown, if you know what I mean. The kind of madness that people can't go and see their dying relatives. And that, I think, showed, a real nasty underbelly of the state. There are a lot of state people involved who saw this as a power grab. And they grabbed power and influence. And some of them aren't letting it go. And this report is an extension of that power and influence and censoriousness. And I think decent journalists need to look at the evidence and push back.
Liam, always a privilege to have you on the show. Liam's got the most incredible Substack. It's all about the economy and politics. It's called When the Facts Change. And of course, he's a Telegraph columnist and the co-host of Planet Normal.